Hello, and welcome to Poetry Soundbite, a new series of poetry readings and interviews available at As It Ought to Be magazine. I'm Chase Dimmick, managing editor of As It Ought to Be magazine, proud to host our fifth installment of the series with our guest today, Agnes Vojta. In a quick and tidy 30 to 45 minutes, we'll learn a little bit about Agnes, hear some of her poems, and explore how she crafts her work. Our poem selections and questions came from my students in my Intro to Poetry class at College of the Canyons, who are helping me put together these interviews as part of our Living Poet project. I thought this would be a cool way to teach poetry as a living, vital art form and encourage participating in the poetry community by meeting real live poets. So today, I'm proud to introduce Agnes Vojta. So Agnes Vojta grew up in Germany and now lives in Rolla, Missouri, where she teaches physics at Missouri S&T and hikes in the Ozarks. She is the author of Porous Land, published in 2019 by Spartan Press, and The Eden of Perhaps, also published by Spartan Press in 2020. And her poems have appeared in a variety of magazines, including here on As It Ought to Be magazine. So without further ado, let me say hello to Agnes Vojta. How are you doing today?
Hi, Chase. I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about being here.
Yeah, and I'm excited to interview and hear more about these poems. And also, we have a Missouri connection because I also used to teach in Missouri as well, way back in the day at Southeast Missouri State. So we both have that experience in rural Missouri, and I always want to say Missouri.
No, don't. Don't.
There's a definite line between where in Missouri you say Missouri and where you say Missouri, because I heard that from both of my students, depending on where in the state they came from.
I have people say that here, but
In Rolla,
yes, some people do. But I don't know
interest.
where you're from, so
Yeah, I figure like more people from the northern part of Missouri is Missouri, and more from the southern, the Ozarks, and from where I used to teach in the Boot Heel region, the Boot Heel of Missouri. I'd hear a lot of Missouri.
yeah.
But anyway, so I'm excited to have you on, and especially because of your background as both a physics teacher and as an immigrant, thus multilingual individual. And so that gets us to our first question from my student, Aman Verdi. And he asks, how are you able to find a balance between your job as a physics professor and poetry? Do you use poetry as an escape and to give your brain a break from all the numbers associated with physics?
That's a good question. I have never thought of something that I had to balance. It's something that is just part of me. So I had this spell when I didn't really write for a number of years, but I've always done something artistic. So I'm a singer. I've sung classical music. I also go hike, and all these things. They're just part of who I am. So there's the physics, but the physics. I've never been a person who has this is single-minded about the physics. There were always other parts that belonged to me and that I had to give room and time to feel like I'm a healthy person in. So the poetry is just it's just part of that, and they are just things that aren't accessible with science. So, physics is wonderful and beautiful, but when you want to talk about human emotion or have a gut response to beauty, I mean, physics is beautiful. Equations are beautiful to me, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Not to everybody. Uh, but that is not the gut wrenching beauty where you have an emotional response. So I feel that I need poetry and art to fully express the human experience.
I like that because sometimes we're inclined, especially today with the difference between STEM and humanities education, to think of these things as somehow opposing one another and that you would pick a side or a team. But the fact is that that's part of that whole history of liberal arts education where you need science to understand poetry and poetry to understand science. And these things are not opposed, they're they mutually inform one another to the different parts of our experience in the world.
Absolutely.
So I like that. I like having that background again because it goes back to the days of when people when scientists wrote poetry, when people had this kind of Renaissance man mentality of you were good at everything in the world instead of today how we kind of compartmentalize things too much. you know so let's get into some of your poems. And the first poem that I want you to read is Waiting for News from the Hospital.
Waiting for news from the hospital. She is on her knees, scrubbing the kitchen tiles, square by gray square. The dark lines of grout meet at right angles. She erases a splatter of tomato sauce, a dusting of flour, a smear of mud, scours until the floor is so clean she wants to lie down, cheek to the cool tile, and breathe the faint lemon smell. She wipes her forehead, stands up, and paces the empty house, looking for something else to clean.
Excellent. So we have two questions about this from my students. The first one coming from Samantha Hornberger, and the question is, I loved reading Waiting for News from the Hospital and the sense of anxiety and stress you're able to fit within it. I think the poem, separate from its title, still works to show this tense uneasiness while also allowing the reader to begin to gauge the kind of person she is, someone who is caring and hardworking. Was the character's constant cleaning, accompanied by the warming details of tomato sauce and flour, supposed to show that she was a hardworking woman, possibly a mother who provided and cooked for a family? Or was the poem more based on the idea that one's anxiety can be so overwhelming that it forces you to find something, anything, that can distract you from waiting for news? So I'll start with that question, and I'll ask you the second one in a bit, since there's a lot of really great ideas to unpack there.
Samantha, this is a fabulous question. And one thing I love about poetry is that there is ambiguity, and that as soon as a poem is out in the world, every reader can bring to the poem their own experience and can take from the poem what speaks to them and what they need. And that is not necessarily the same thing as the poet put into the poem, which, if I may digress, this is my pet peeve about how poetry is so often ruined for people in school when it's presented as if this a puzzle and you have to guess what did the author want to say. And poetry is not a puzzle, is not a riddle. And I love hearing your interpretation about what those details mean, because that had not occurred to me at all. And it's just, but it makes perfect sense. And I just love that. So that yes, that could be a hardworking mother, and the kitchen could be a homey place. Actually, when I wrote the poem, I was more thinking of the your second interpretation. And for full disclosure, this is actually something that happened to me. What I sometimes like to do is I like to write a poem in third person, even if it's my own experience, to get a little bit of separation and to remove myself from that closeness. When I was waiting for news from the hospital, I get nervous, and when I'm nervous, I can't focus. When I have anxiety, I can't focus on work or reading. So cleaning is perfect because there's the repetitive motion,
Mm-hmm.
and it's mindless, but you get some energy out. And if you're at the end still worried, at least you have a clean kitchen floor. But beyond that, so these were all details that happen in a lived-in house. So there is this lived-in house which is now empty except for this one person. And what I was thinking of is partly this dichotomy between those details of a messy life that she is erasing, to, in one sense, bring some control to the situation where there is so much that she cannot control. And this is the one thing she has control over. She can clean that floor. And the other thing those details play with is this a contrast between the messy life part and then this sterility. So the tile by tile, so the systematic process, and then the lines that meet at right angle. And but you know what? All those things are not a conscious choice. So I'm not sitting there saying I want to have these three details that show the messy life, and then I want to have this image of the right angled crowd lines. This is just it just comes out like that, and then so much of this is an unconscious choice, and then you can think about, okay, how did that happen, and what did I actually put in there?
And that, I think that transitions well to what Aman got out of the poem as well. And he wrote that, I love the way you bring a fresh look to the hospital floor in Waiting for News from the Hospital. As a healthcare worker, and I like the way that he made the connection there. As a healthcare worker, I'm extremely grateful for environmental services for eliminating the smells that come from a human body and replacing them with scents that remind me of home. How were you able to make the connection between the hospital and home? And did your inspiration for this poem come from spending a lot of time in the hospital yourself?
Actually, not at all. I have never been in the hospital except for an outpatient procedure.
Hmm.
So I have not spent a lot of time in the hospital. And that is, again, a beautiful thought and something that I didn't think of until now, how the cleanliness of that finely clean kitchen floor corresponds and interacts with that sterile environment of the hospital,
Hmm.
where creating this may bring the subject of the poem mentally closer to that hospital
Hmm.
environment that is far away where she cannot be. But yeah, that's a it's a great idea, but
Hmm.
I did
I
not
like
think of
that.
that before.
Well, and the fact that the answer to was this your own experience is no, does not then mean that that interpretation and what Amon got from it personally would then be invalid.
Oh, absolutely not. That is the beautiful thing, that whatever you bring to a poem, whatever you read out of a poem, it's all valid.
Hmm.
In another in Portland, I have a lot of poems about my kids leaving for college. I had people
Hmm.
to me about how they could relate to those poems about divorce. So it's it absolutely has nothing to do with divorce, but to them that was it spoke
Right.
in that situation, and that is one of the beautiful things about
Yeah.
poetry.
Yeah, that's one of the wonderful things that we can connect with is that two people can be going through completely different circumstances in life, but the emotional resonance of it hits them the same way and helps one illuminate the other. And so, what I liked was, again, you never know who's going to receive your poem. Like John Dorsey said last week, he sends those out in the world and he doesn't know who's going to receive it. And that actually helps him write and not worry too much about some of the finer details because it's going to hit people in ways he won't be able to predict anyway. So he doesn't have to worry too much about trying to predict. And that's one of the beautiful things, I think. So let's go on to your next poem. This is Emancipation. And and this one was also popular and had two questions from two students as well.
Emancipation. She has come of age. She escaped the guardianship of her stern older sister, who plans her life with a straight edge. She is the meanderer who discovers delicious detours and does not flinch when the briars cut her skin. She is the story seeker and word weaver, dream dancer and rooftop shouter, who does not care to appear ordinary. She is the cliff diver and dragon tamer, fire walker and forbidden fruit eater, and sometimes gets in trouble and has to be rescued by her sensible sister, who watches over her, worried and amazed, and with a twinge of jealousy.
Excellent. So I got two questions. First one from Jay Diekman and the second one from Adam Burton. And we'll start with Jay's question, answer that, and then go to Adam since it's more about craft, and the first one's more about theme. So Jay writes, the poem Emancipation is very beautifully written and reminds me of my relationship with my older sister. I do notice the use of the word escaped in the first line of the poem when talking about no longer being under the care of her older sister, which creates a very heavy negative connotation. Since it seems to me that the siblings presented here still have a decent relationship, my question is, why escaped specifically? And then it's interesting that the next question is more about an ending. So we'll start with that one, escaped.
Well, um, this is another situation where I was putting something very specific into the poem, and people can read it in many different ways. So I was not actually thinking of two literal human being sisters. What I was trying to express in the poem is the struggle that all artists I know and many other, probably maybe even most other people have between two sides of the personality. There is a sensible, rational person who's reasonable, who does the sensible things, who budgets her money and saves for retirement and goes to work 9 to 5 and does things well the sensible way. And then there is this artist child inside that wants to do the crazy stuff, that wants to explore in the briars, that wants to go off the beaten path, do something that is not ordinary, and is for the most part of life under the guardianship and very strict control of the sensible, rational part of the persona. And I wrote this poem in a time where I was going through a big personal transition, and where it was important to me to liberate that part of me and give that part the room to grow and unfold. And so to me, it felt like an escape of that, of the creative mind from the controlling mind. And that's why there is the word escape, because essentially this is a poem about freedom to unfold. And I think I don't want to say all, because never say absolutes, right? But I know for many people, they carry those two parts of their personality, and in our daily life, we are always it's usually the rational, sensible part that gets the
Mhm.
praise, and the part that shows up on time and adheres to the deadline and does the homework, and that gets the good grades. And sometimes, but there's also this crazy unconventional spirit in there, and that is so important for feeling alive, and that should get let out at some point.
So ultimately, it for where you were coming from, the sister is a personification, and that you are both characters
I'm
in this.
both. Yes,
You are both characters in
they're
this, and
both me.
it's interesting. So there's two external characters because it's written in the third person. There's a she and sister, and in this case, you're now both of them. So I think
Yes.
that that's interesting because we've been exploring the idea of selves in poems, and one of the big things that Mike James said in the first one that we did is that the I in his poems are not necessarily me, whereas in your case, a she might be me.
Yes.
And that's what that's one of the wonderful things that poetry does, is that it allows you to play and go in and out of self. And then going back to what you were saying about interpretation, that again, whatever you get out of it is meaningful and correct. So if you look into this and see not an inner relationship, but an outer relationship, like Jay did with Jay's sister, then that is also a completely meaningful and productive interpretation as well.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful thing. So That's fantastic if you recognize a relationship with your own sibling there.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, because I think we all have that a big brother or big sister in our heads that's telling us what to do, like the Freudian superego. So sometimes that big sister is a different person. Sometimes that big sister is how your sister got into your head, and sometimes that big sister is just your own voice speaking to you in your head. So, and let's go to Adam's question about this. So Adam asked, in poetry, I often notice the line which ends a stanza will be an incomplete sentence, later completed in the first line of the next stanza. I found it interesting in Emancipation. When you were describing a young woman coming of age, you finished stanza 4 by saying that she, quote, sometimes gets in trouble and has to be, which you then finish in stanza 5 with, rescued by your sensible sister. Are those pauses between stanzas ever intentional? I found myself interpreting the words and has to be very differently before moving on to the next stanza. I aim for double meaning all the time when writing lyrics myself, and I wonder if that can be the same with your own process.
Oh, absolutely. So in general, this it's not just with the stanza breaks. You also see that in poems when you with the line breaks. So some poems they end their lines with a period or a comma. They're called end stop lines. And then there are poems where the sentence or the thought doesn't end at the end of the line and where it just continues. That's called enjambment. And
Mhm.
that is always intentional. That is one of the ways in which you, as you say, bring in extra layers of meaning and can create a little bit of a twist. So yeah, they're usually intentional.
Yeah, I've always interpreted lines like that. So, like, and in this case, Adam's talking about stanzas 4 and 5. The and sometimes gets into trouble and has to be pause rescued by her sensible sister. And I think that when a line is broken into 2 stanzas, it really forces the reader to pause because we have to literally pause further than we normally would, which gives the line more time to breathe, more time to hit, and therefore the reader more time to think about it. And so that opens up more possibilities because they have to think more before they get to that next line. So there's more interpretation going on. You're almost forcing them to sit and pause and think about it before you move on. And plus, you don't know what the next line is going to be. So you get to see the first half of the line by itself and then get the second half. So I always think that that like opens up more possibilities.
Definitely is one of my favorite things to play with.
And it's funny because I almost never do that in my own poems, and I don't know why. Maybe I'm just too much of a control freak, and I'm like, no, this will end right here. Or maybe I just like being super organized and have every stanza like contained or something like that. I don't know. It's always interesting to sometimes you don't even realize why you're not doing something with a poem, and you got to ask yourself, why am I? You know why you're making choices, but then you don't know why are you not making a different choice.
Yeah.
So, speaking of that, let's go to our third poem, which has another question from Adam. And this poem is Suffering is Not a Competition.
Suffering is not a competition. There are no judges who weigh grief against grief. No trophies for the heaviest burden, no ribbons for the most deserving despair. Do not compare. You must pull yourself out of the swamp by your own hair. Declare yourself healed. There will be no spectators applauding at the finish line. No paparazzi snapping, no journalists waiting for an interview. Only you will know that you've made it with nothing to show than your heart still beating.
Excellent. I especially love that one. So Adam asks, your poem, Suffering is Not a Competition, was very profound and inspirational for me. The notion that one's experience of struggle is purely personal strikes me as such a helpful topic to write about. I'm wondering if there was a revelatory moment for you somewhere that caused you to deliver this message in the poem.
I don't really recall a single moment, but you know that very often when somebody is in pain, people tell them about experiences and usually comes in two different ways. There are the people who want to be helpful and tell that person, well, think of such and such, they have it much worse. And then there's the person who has this kind of one-upmanship and a hey, and I have it so much worse, and you're
Mhm.
stop whining. And neither of them is actually helpful to the person who is in pain. Because it's not a competition. Their pain is as valid as the other person's pain,
Mhm.
even if it's about something that is, if you were weighing, that might seem less severe and less serious. And I wrote this poem in 2019, but what I found is that so way before the coronavirus pandemic, but what I found is that during the pandemic, that became even more pertinent because everybody was suffering. Everybody had a
Mhm.
loss, everybody was grieving something. And then there were all those feelings of, okay, I'm grieving this thing that seems trivial, but I'm really sad about this, and I'm really distraught. But there is another person who had a loved one die, or there's a person who lost their job. Am I even allowed to be sad? Am I allowed to grieve? And so when I read this poem, this was the poem that resonated most with the audience throughout the last year, that spoke to people because there was so much grief and so much
Mhm.
suffering. And no, it's not helpful to judge whether your grief is worthy. Just, it's okay to be sad even if somebody else is also sad, because it doesn't help that person if you think your suffering is not worthy.
Yeah. I've worked and volunteered in the past as a crisis counselor for people going through anxiety and depression in difficult times. And I've noticed that a lot of people, when they're going through tough times, will say, I have no reason to complain, or my pain is invalid, or it doesn't make sense, or there's people going through worse in the world. And I think that reflects the problem in our society that you brought up, which is that we're always like saying, well, if somebody else has it worse, then just deal with it. But everybody could find somebody who has it worse. And more importantly, it assumes that emotions are somehow irrational, and that what if you have one, it's irrational to have that. But in fact, an emotion is never irrational. If you're feeling pain, you're feeling pain. If you're feeling sad, you're feeling sad. It doesn't matter what caused it. An emotion is valid and reasonable no matter what it is. It's what we do about it that could be reasonable or unreasonable. But if you're feeling pain, you're feeling pain, and your pain is real, no matter what triggered it. And I think it's always important for somebody going through a crisis to understand that your pain is valid, no matter what caused it. The question is, what's the reasonable thing we're going to do in response to the pain?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And yeah, especially during COVID, I really like what you brought up there, because everybody is going through pain due to COVID. Some people maybe more, some people more than others per se, but it's one of the few times in human history where like literally everybody has been hit by the same thing. Like nobody's life isn't being profoundly affected by this, by the horrible tragedy that is COVID-19. Very rarely in human history is there one huge group experience that unites everybody, and everybody has lost something. Some people have lost more than others, but everybody is experiencing loss, and it's important to remember. And I like how your poem reflects that. So let's get on to the fourth poem. And this one actually has a question from me. Those first three poems were super popular, and those were the ones my students gravitated toward. I wanted to add a fourth poem, Flotsam, one, because I think that was the first poem I published of yours on As It Ought to Be, so it's got a sentimental connection for me. But I think it also explores some key themes and background that we haven't yet talked about from you as a poet. So if you could read Flotsam for me.
Flotsam. I shipped my past to this continent on a box I open rarely. In it, my mother's amber necklace and my grandmother's silver cross. A dried flower from my prom bouquet, ribboned letters from old lovers, notebooks with poems written 30 years ago in another tongue, a leather pouch I carried around my neck, a brass key that opens no lock I know, a photograph of the house on the hill that stands now empty, where my voice still echoes unheard 5,000 miles away.
Excellent. So here's my question. In this poem, you write that you shipped your past to this continent, but you rarely open it. I am wondering what this has to say about the experience of being an immigrant to the United States. How does poetry help you express the experience of being an immigrant to the USA and navigating cultural and linguistic differences?
That's a great question, and it's a complicated question. So when I moved here permanently, I had lived in the US temporarily before, but when we actually immigrated, I was writing in German before then, and I actually had one of my most productive writing years the year before we came. And then I noticed that at some points I just no longer could write. I couldn't write in German anymore and I couldn't write in English. And that was not because of language ability. So I was teaching at college. My English was just fine, but it wasn't my emotional language yet. And
Hmm.
so I had a 10-year period where I did not write at all. And only after about 10 years, very, very slowly, it started that I could write. And at some point, it was as if a dam had burst, and then the poems started coming out in English. And I have not actually written a whole lot about the immigrant experience. I have only started delving deeper into that subject over the past year because I'm now also dealing with aging parents overseas, and that is very difficult and was something that I had not anticipated when we emigrated. This is my 20th year here in Missouri. So there are all kinds of thoughts that go through your mind when you're leaving, but that the implications of elder care and aging parents and that whole thing compounded by an external situation with pandemic that makes it impossible to travel home for family emergencies, that just hit over the last year. So I'm writing more about, yeah, the feelings of raising my children in two cultures and the dealing with the loss not just of family but for an immigrant the loss of the family members back home is also a loss of home a second time, because
Hmm.
first time when you leave you know it's permanent, but you have a place that you can still call home, that you we travel back every summer. And as long as there is this place, which for me is my childhood home in Dresden, I still have that connection and I still call Germany home. But
Hmm.
I know that once my parents are there, that connection goes away. And then, yes, we have still a few friends, but once that place that you called home is no longer a place you can actually physically go to, that is a loss a second time. And I'm currently working on, I think my next collection is going to deal with that topic.
That would be, and I'm looking forward to reading that collection because that's a fascinating topic. And you brought up such a really good insight there that immigration is not a is not does not end by the act of moving to another country. Like it
That's when it
doesn't stop.
starts.
Yeah,
That's
like that's what.
that's when the whole process begins.
Wow. Whereas we usually think once you have immigrated, like in American history, it's once you got over into Ellis Island on the boat, you have immigrated. But the immigrant story, like you said, begins at that moment. And you're 20 years into this and still immigrating in terms of home as a concept in your mind.
Yeah, I think it's really once you step on, well, back then it was the boat, and here the plane, that is when the journey begins and the whole immigrant experience and unfolds in the new country. It includes things like raising children bilingually, uh, so that they're fluent in their native language, taking them back, immersing them in their culture of their family of origin, while at the same time making sure that they're fluent in English, that they're adapted, that they grow up with the traditions here, and this constant balance. It's like doing the splits between two worlds. And so and then yes, there may be periods of relative calm where there's not a lot of upheaval. Then the situation with dealing with elderly parents. So I think for an
Mhm.
immigrant, immigration is a lasting kind of trauma that
Mhm.
accompanies them throughout their lives. You're never done with it because there's always a a relationship to your old country that pops up in various facets. And I don't think it's any immigrant is ever finished with that story.
And that's interesting because that no matter where you immigrated from, it seems like that's a common experience. And then the circumstances under which you um, immigrate, like the reasons why and what's been going on in one's previous country, make it different. But that idea of straddling two countries and two cultures and two languages, and then building your life in America, that's a common experience. And it's really fascinating to hear it from different perspectives. So,
And I have to say, I want to say I'm a privileged immigrant because
mhm,
immigrants are created equal. So first of all, I did not escape a horrible war or poverty. And the
mhm,
second thing is once I arrive here, I'm I never had a person give me grief for speaking in German to my children on the street.
mhm.
His classmate, whose mother is Venezuelan, she got grief for speaking to her child in Spanish on the street. So, immigrants, not all immigrants are treated in the same way. And I am very lucky that as a German white person, everybody says, "Oh, it's so cool that you speak German. It's so cool that you are here, and it's so wonderful." Immigrants from many other countries do not have that positive reception. So.
Wow. And that's such a really good point is that so there's certain things that are universal to the immigrant experience. And then there are other things that based on uh, some of the prejudices and norms that get enforced unfairly in the United States change the immigrant experience based on where they came from, where the immigrant came from. So you're right, coming from like what you said, a privileged experience um, that you didn't have to encounter what people from countries, from other countries, coming from different racial or cultural backgrounds have had to face. And I think it's interesting that you factor that in. It's very different from the experience Bung Kong Tuan described in our second poetry soundbite, coming over from Cambodia as a child and experiencing racism and prejudice growing up in Massachusetts. It's a very different experience.
Yeah, absolutely. There is no comparison. And the interesting thing is that even for people who have that privileged immigration experience, there is still an intrinsic difficulty of making that transition. In my
Mhm.
workplace, almost everybody is a first generation immigrant. We have
Wow.
very few colleagues in our physics department who were born in this country, and almost everybody I work with has been born elsewhere and has emigrated here as an adult.
Wow. That's absolutely amazing. So we've got a couple of minutes left. So I thought we'd end with a couple of craft questions real quickly. So Samantha asks, in my own experience with writing poetry, I often write more pieces I don't like than ones that I do, leaving me with countless journals filled with poems I don't want to look at anymore. Yeah, join the club. If you ever find yourself writing a piece you don't feel great about, what do you do in order to make it something you're proud of? In other words, how would you go about approaching journals filled with bad pieces?
Oh, I have journals filled with bad pieces, lots and lots. So I usually write in pencil in actual notebooks. And one of the advantages of that is that when I edit, I just cross out and rewrite. So the notebooks have the complete history of the poem, whereas when I write on the computer, but when I do that, I tend to just save the edited version and edit over it and not save all the iterations with all the changes. And there's some loss in that. So I have stacks of notebooks with fragments of poems, with drafts of poems, with just single lines or single images, and then with poems that were finished and didn't go anywhere. I keep them, and every once in a while, I look through them, and sometimes I remember, oh, I tried to write about this thing. Let me see if I can find the draft. And then some of them, when you come back to them a year later, you see, oh, there's actually some good pieces, and just cut out a bunch of things and rewrite it. Sometimes there's a single line that is salvageable and then gets a new life in a completely different poem.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's just a lot of words that never make a good poem, and then they stay there. And I think you have to write a lot to write some good things, and most of the things will not be particularly good, but it's all practice, and you
Mhm.
know which one is gonna be the good one in the end. So I mean, sometimes I have a gut feeling. Sometimes a poem forms in the head and then just comes on the page fully formed, and you don't have to edit it. And I know John Dorsey writes like that, but I absolutely do not. I usually massively overwrite, and then I pare it down, and it's like chiseling out a sculpture out of a vast block of stuff, just peeling out the essence. So I usually write too much and then I take away,
Mhm.
refine that. But all those drafts and all those notes, they're great to have. I just looked through some really old stuff that I have in German that I unsuccessfully tried to translate. And I found some really great images, and I will give myself permission not to translate the poem, but to just steal my own image and make a new poem where I use that.
That's, I mean, that's fascinating. And I think I call it the poetry junkyard, that I'll keep unsuccessful pieces because you never know when you need a new front bumper or a new headlight, and you can scavenge it from something else that already existed. So I'll pick up lines that didn't work somewhere else and insert it when I need it, or build it around something, but I think it's important to keep that stuff around because those aren't bad poems per se. They're pieces that might find their fit later, or a jumping off point that might inspire something later. But it's important not to think of it as failure, in my opinion, but as practice, like playing a sport, doing your drills, doing your footwork, doing your bench presses and your exercise. A little mistake in practice, it doesn't matter because that's how we learn. So
Absolutely. There's a lot of scales you play when you learn to play an instrument, and etudes and just warming up. And also sometimes it's just fun to write a bad poem. When I
yes.
have writer's block, I write silly stuff in form because there's no pressure because nobody's gonna ever publish that. So I can just
Hmm.
be goofy and silly. So earlier I this year I was so stuck. I said, I'm not gonna budge. I will write a villanelle. I don't care if it's a bad villanelle. I managed to work in 6 kinds of wines in there because they help with the rhyme. And at the end, I had an evening of fun, a really not good villanelle, but it was very satisfying to just have played with the words,
Yeah.
sounds, and just not worried about, is this art with a capital A?
Yeah. I think
My,
writers, yeah, I think writers more than other types of artists worry too much about the finished product and worry too much about, is this publishable? Is this good? Instead of just simply enjoying the process of it. Because ultimately, I think in life, you have to enjoy process if you're going to be happy. So if you want to just write for yourself, write for yourself. If you want to be silly, be silly. Because you got to enjoy it. You have to enjoy the work as you're doing the work, or you're going to be miserable.
yeah, that's the whole point of writing poetry or of playing the guitar or of dancing. You gotta enjoy it while you're doing it.
Right. If you get angry and frustrated every time you mess up a chord on the guitar, you're just going to make yourself miserable. You have to enjoy the, like Bob Ross would say, the happy accidents. One more question and then we'll wrap up. So Jay asks, I find it hard to write poetry sometimes because I feel the craft can be limiting and I feel as though I can never quite get it right. I really enjoy the narratives you tell in your poetry because of the way they are presented. So I have to ask, how long did it take you to find your current style slash voice?
It's a process. When I wrote in German before coming here, I was writing actually in form. It was all rhymed and metered, very, very little
Mhm.
free verse. And then when I started writing again, I wrote pretty much in free verse, mostly, and mostly lyrical poems, very imagist poems with nature themes. So in my first collection, I think there's not a single poem that has a third person narrative.
Mhm.
There are a few poems that involve a second person where I'm addressing someone, but there's nothing narrative in there, and only a couple of years ago, I started writing a few slightly more narrative poems, and it's not until last year that I've really tried to explore narrative and try to tell stories in my poems. So this for me is very new. What I kept from the old me is the imagist bent. So I still like to write sparsely with
Mhm.
emphasis on the image, not too many modifiers, but develop that narrative style to see if I like it. I don't even know if I actually want to tell stories in my poems, so I'm still playing around with this and say if once I feel that I can do it, I actually want to write like that, or whether I want to go back to really short images nature poems. So I'll see.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of your poems kind of straddle the line between lyrical and narrative, because a lot of them do have a plot, a story progression, but they're more like when you do that, they're more like a parable. Like there's a very fairy tale-esque aspect to some of the poems, especially in your second book. And you play with mythology a little bit like that. And that's the thing about myth is that mythology is more about, it's a more condensed story than like something that's like more than an epic per se. Um, but that's interesting. And by the way, to go to a point that you made earlier about finding your voice, I thought I was fascinated when you said that English, it took a long time for English to become your emotional voice.
Yeah, and I don't know how else to describe it. Actually, there was a key moment, and that was only in the last year or so. At the beginning, when we moved here, I used English, of course, in my daily life for everything. We spoke to our children in German, but I was fluent. I read in English. I just couldn't write poetry, and my husband and I we would also speak in German to each other. And over the past year, I noticed so we speak sometimes German, sometimes English now, and I noticed that now if there's something emotional that I want to talk about or something that is difficult for me to talk about, I resort to English, and it had not happened like 5 years back. So there is, I would say, the English has now is really the language in which I think about my thoughts, my emotions. And the beginning, when I was journaling, I would journal in German. Over the last 3 years, I have journaled exclusively in English. So my diaries, it's all in English. And I think that transition went hand in hand with the transition to being able to write. And I think there is a positive reinforcement between the two, that the more I write poetry, the more I process emotion in the English language, and the more natural that becomes to me to use the English for this type of subject and no longer the German.
So that's really fascinating that part of you finding your voice as a poet was also the process of finding your voice in English and finding your emotional and personal footing within a language. And poetry itself can be a language unto itself too.
Yeah, I had not expected that to be such a long process.
I mean, languages are complicated and they come and go. I mean, my German is nicht sehr gut. Um, and I've forgotten most of the German that I learned in grad school. But anyway, we got to wrap things up. But one more time, I want to thank you so much, Agnes, for joining us and sharing with our students, and thank my students again for the wonderful questions. Any last words before we go?
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast, and I absolutely love that you're doing this series for your class and with your class. It was so much fun. Thanks for having me, Chase.
All right. And thank you so much for being our guest. So we're going to sign off for now and bye-bye.